Good afternoon, everybody. Greg Riedman here with the Newton-Needham Regional Chamber. Pleased to have you with us this morning. Appreciative of Congressman Joe Kennedy being with us. Before we get into Congressman, just one note I wanted to mention. We're doing a lot of these webinars with our elected leaders and with other subject matter experts, and wanted to mention that we have one this afternoon at 4:15 with Samaritans about suicide prevention, how to talk to folks about it, whether it's on your team or your employees, your family, and we recommend that you join us if you can for that 4:15 registration on our website, and information on other items that we're doing on our website as well, nnchamber.com. But right now, I wanted to welcome Congressman Kennedy with us. I don't see on my screen. Oh, there you are. Congressman, first of all, thank you so much for your time today and your leadership. We're really grateful. And I wanted to start with the same question that I think we all ask everybody when we first talk to them, which is, how are you? How's your family, kids, wife, extended family, and your staff doing?
Greg, first off, thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this. I think obviously critically important opportunity for me, but for I assume a number of your members out there that are really concerned about how they care for their employees, how they care for their businesses, how they make their own ends meet, and how we find a way to get through this all together. And so looking forward to this to try to get some additional information out to your members. And then also with the very clear acknowledgement that because some of these things are moving so fast, because they have to, the end of the month, the beginning of the month are critical times for everybody in terms of bills getting paid and bills coming due. That we want to make sure this money gets out, but because the bill was just, the big recovery package was just signed into law last Friday, there's still some guidance here that needs to come from the federal government, from the agencies down to states. We're trying to get some of that done as quickly and as clearly as we can. But as people have questions, please reach out. And I think we've got 2 people in my office that are working basically completely dedicated to the recovery package here, whether that's individually or small businesses, unemployment assistance, the rest of it. And Kevin O'Neill's taking point on that in our office, and his email address will be put up in the chat so people can get it. I know, Greg, you can spin it around. How are we doing? It's a great question. On the grand scheme of things, we're doing great. We got 2 little ones, 2 and 4. They are healthy and mostly happy. They are doing their best to burn down the house or somehow destroy it every single day, which I guess is what a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old do when you are in a shelter in place for a week plus. But we're getting through it like everybody else. You will probably hear some screams in the background. That's not coming from me, but that is coming from them. So we're doing fine, and staff is fine. Everybody's doing well, and I think, like everybody though, I'm very concerned for what we're seeing from our neighbors and our friends. I'm sure my family, like everybody else's, I've had extended family members that have been diagnosed. I've had friends who have lost their jobs. I have an awful lot of, I know some people that are very, very sick, and obviously some friends that have actually very sadly succumbed to the virus. So a very serious circumstance, and I know we will get through it, but not without some significant pain and discomfort still to come. And I hope you guys are well, and obviously all of your members too.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start just really use this as a forum to answer as many questions as we possibly can, make this a resource for your members. But why don't I start with just a bit of an overview and some level of detail as to the Recovery Act, the CARES Act that Congress did, the House finally passed last week and signed into law. Some top line numbers here that I think are helpful. So about $250 billion in direct payments. And that means that that's done largely just through the IRS system and the tax system. If you filed a tax return last year in 2018, and what that means is if you've made it under $75,000, you're going to get $1,200 and you get $500 for a child. If you, that $1,200 slides down to about $1,000 if you earn less than $99,000. And so that should be automatic. That should be coming out, and we expect that will be coming out in a matter of days to a week or so, where that money will come out. The next big bucket here from that recovery package is the $350 billion to small businesses. That's a big number, it's a big figure, and there's a bunch of different buckets here. So first part is forgivable loans and $10 billion in grants to small businesses, tribal business concerns, and certain nonprofits. The loans go through a new SBA 7A paycheck prevention program, or protection program, excuse me, that can be forgiven when used for payroll costs, including paid leave, healthcare, and other costs to retain workers, other expenses such as rent, mortgage, and utilities. And small businesses can also apply for up to $10,000 in grants to retain workers and pay for debt obligations. We can get into more details in a second, but that's $350 billion dedicated to small businesses and nonprofits. And I'll go through the eligibility issues in a second. But the goal here is actually to make sure that small businesses are able to, just as we said, protect their payrolls, protect employees, keep them on their payroll, give them up to $10 million in what potentially is going to be a completely forgivable loan, so a grant over time. And even if they can't make those overall requirements, a very low interest loan, so to make sure that small businesses are able to stay afloat. And then the last piece that I wanted to touch on was this unemployment assistance, which is the third big package. We saw the payroll numbers come out, the unemployment numbers, excuse me, come out this morning, which are devastating. Going to obviously get significantly worse over the course of the next couple of weeks as more states put in place the shelter-in-place orders. This unemployment package differs in three main respects. The first, there's an additional $600 a week bump that was put in place in this one than existing unemployment insurance. So that's a big $600. Second, we actually broadened the definition for unemployment. So it actually includes independent contractors, it includes gig economy workers, so that people are actually there's more people eligible. And the third is it's an extension of for 13 weeks on the back end for individuals that have exhausted their state benefits. There is an issue here you might have heard or read, and I'm sure the Chamber's given some guidance, of a disconnect between the state and the federal government's what we just legislated because of this expansion and recalibration of some of these benefits. The state system that had been integrated with the federal system being changed, it's going to take a little while to get that state system and federal system integrated again, particularly when it comes to some of those folks that were not previously eligible. So those gig workers, Uber, Lyft, et cetera. We are pushing very hard, the delegation, congressional delegation as a whole is pushing very hard on the Department of Labor to try to get that guidance down to states as quickly as we possibly can to integrate those systems and make sure that those systems are up and running so that people can apply and get the benefits that they need. Because we know that people need, it's not just the size of the amount of money that people need, but they need it now and they need it urgently. And so we're pushing very hard on that. The last thing I want to say, and then happy to take questions, or Greg, if you want me to get into deeper detail on this. Very well aware that this package, even though it's $2.2 trillion, the biggest and most robust economic recovery package ever passed by Congress, it's probably not going to be enough. And part of that is largely contingent on whether we are able to get in front of, whether we're able to build up our healthcare infrastructure to get in front of this virus over the course of the coming weeks. The ultimate way we get to an economic recovery is you get the spread of the virus under control. And the idea behind much of this economic package was to buy some time to make sure we could do that, make sure that people could focus on getting healthy and safe and keeping their loved ones healthy and safe and not worry about having to go to work in order to meet those obligations. But if we need to do more, we need to do more. And that's where we're going to be really dependent on Greg, you and your leadership and folks from the chamber to let us know and let me know what else we need to do in order to make sure that people can, in fact, stay afloat and make ends meet and care for their employees and keep their businesses alive. That is the goal behind this. We want you to do well. And if there's things here that we need to adjust or to change or to alter, let us know. I know there's going to be a lot of concern and anxiety over the speed with which some of this money gets deployed. We're working on that. Doesn't mean don't mention it. Doesn't mean don't say, hey, we've got challenges here. Let us know. But know that we are trying to address that as quickly as we can. But as there's other issues that come up, let us know. And with that, Greg, happy to get into more detail or just take questions, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I think there's a lot of focus, obviously, among our membership about this, the payroll protection plan, and a lot of confusion too. And what we know is that there's an available application online, so people can now start to see the questions are going to be asked, and then tomorrow they can go to their SBA lender and actually apply. There was a little concern that maybe someone who already applied for one of the other SBA programs, like the disaster loan program that was available last week, can't apply for the PPP, but I'm hearing Kevin O'Neill told me from your team earlier that that's not true. You can still apply for both. We'd love to clarify that, either you or Kevin, if we can.
So that's my understanding. And that's my understanding from Kevin. Let me make, we can double check on that, but that is my understanding here. And that, again, the goal behind this is to make sure that people do get access to the resources that they need. And it's not, I don't think that, well, we have set up a number of different buckets here for small businesses in particular. It's not to be wholeheartedly exclusive. It's also to try to say, hey, we know that there's going to be some businesses that need X, there's some that need Y, there's some that need Z, and there's certain ways that either businesses are structured or that are going to make some of these programs more applicable and more attractive to them than others, right? And so they're trying to make sure that those pieces fit.
Right. So 350 billion sounds like a lot of money to me, but I can't tell you a business that I don't know that's not applying for it and trying to. So and I'm sure that our bank lenders will be overwhelmed tomorrow with requests, and it's going to require a little more patience, like everything else in this process.
It is, and that's where, again, I don't want to tell people that not to raise that concern. I will tell you that we know it's going to, I know of systems that have already crashed over. And so we know that no system was set up to deal with the number of inquiries and the volume that we think we are certain is already there and is coming. That being said, it is why we have some level of redundancy here. So those direct cash payments that should be able to provide, again, I wish it was more, but that $1,200 that should be coming in a matter of days, that should be provide at least some level of assistance for people. One, two, the unemployment piece, right? So if you have been laid off, that there's a pretty generous package. Again, it's not as good, obviously, as being able to stay and keep your job, but there's a more generous unemployment recovery package here that can help. And then the third is the small business protection piece. So between those three, you've got different layers that, while the small business piece might take a little longer to get that money out, those other two should be immediate. And the direct payment piece, again, should be done directly off of if you filed a tax return last year, you should just get that money, right? Particularly if you've got a direct deposit, if you paid your taxes by direct deposit, that money should be coming back into your bank account or coming to you by check if you paid by check. The unemployment assistance piece, you got to file for it, right? And file for unemployment, but if you file for it, that should come more quickly. So you've got a sliding scale here still as to kind of the pace of deployment for these funds, understanding the urgency to get them all out as quickly as possible.
So question, what support is being given for the nonprofit community? I know that nonprofits are eligible for this PPP program, although not the largest nonprofits, and your colleague Seth Moulton has proposed something to maybe cover some of the larger ones. Are you familiar with that? Or
I haven't seen Seth's proposal here, but the goal here obviously is to make sure that people get protected, right? And so nonprofits, all nonprofits, 501c3s are eligible for that payroll protection program that have fewer than 500 employees. So some of the bigger ones, yes, they run into an issue. I think the goal here is to try to make sure that that those obviously have adequate resources as well. There was, I think, some questions as to whether those larger nonprofits, how questions on their resources and timing and et cetera. But I think without question, we've got some very large nonprofit structures in this country that are going to need help and assistance. And particularly, Greg, for some of them, I appreciate your guidance on some of this too. For those nonprofits that are either funded philanthropically or with an endowment, most of them at the moment are, like in this present moment, are actually okay. The question is going to be, if this goes on for all that much longer, which I think many of us expect that there will be significant financial discomfort for a period of, at the very least, months, that charitable giving the value of those endowments, et cetera, take a pretty big hit, that challenge there with those larger nonprofits is actually going to lag. So while they might have solicited their funding to keep going for the next several months, and already have that assured, that what we saw back in 2008, shortly thereafter, as the recession rolled on, it was devastating nonprofits because endowments took a huge hit, philanthropic giving took a big hit, and the need skyrocketed. So I think this is going to be a space where we are going to need to do more work, without question.
Right, and I imagine you see there's another COVID-4 reform package that Congress needs to do. There's going to need to be something. And
yes, and so that COVID-4, I think, at the very least 4, and potentially more. And so the way I look at this anyway was, this was a rescue package, and then at the very least you need a recovery package, and we might need a rescue A and B and C, right, depending on if we are able to get in front of the spread of this virus and how quickly it's going to take, or how quickly we were able to do so. But questions there around, from my perspective, again, assistance to our healthcare sector, community health centers, hospitals, direct cash payments that should be, I believe, universal and enable individual families to actually meet their own obligations in the way that most fits their needs, was one of the big pieces I was pushing for. The issues around nonprofits and some issues around eligibility for smaller businesses too, that we're trying to look at and make sure that we got that balance right. So I think there's in all likelihood another package that might need to come. Some of that might be large financial assistance again. Some of them might just be tweaks to policies that we need to do. One of the bigger ones we did already was around telemedicine, right? There's a financial impact of that, yes, but what that also was allowing doctors to diagnose people at home and get reimbursed for it, rather than having people come into the hospital and potentially get other people sick, right? So there's I think a chance that some of those reforms that are put in place provide more flexibility to things like states and municipalities and local governments to gain access to funds that we've now appropriated. We gave them a fair amount of money, but every mayor that I talked to said, hey, that's great, but I need to be able to customize some of this response to my local city and town. Not every problem here is going to be able to be solved with the same bucket across the country. And
is election reform part of that too?
Look, I hope so. We passed in this package, I think it was about $400 million for election reform. So things like support for states that are moving elections, vote by mail, et cetera. I think there's going to have to be a lot more that needs to be done there, particularly with regards. So vote by mail, one, it's expensive. So one, we should do it, right? Period. Particularly people are concerned about going out. We need to look at whatever measures are put in place to make sure that people can still have access to the franchise without putting their health and safety at risk. Not surprising to you, I think in my opinion on this, some states do a better job at this already than others. A big high turnouts will have lines at polls even here, but you haven't seen lines at polls that are 5, 6, 7 hours long like you do in some parts of the country, where you shouldn't be congregating in line for 7 hours in the midst of a pandemic, right? So one, for folks that want to vote by mail, that they should be able to have access to that and vote by mail. Two, this is where early vote, I think, is so incredibly important. We've had it here in the presidential primary, and we've had it in the last couple elections in Massachusetts. It makes it so much easier to be able to go in over a series of days that is convenient for you to go and cast a ballot. Whenever I've done it, there hasn't been a line. And it's a lot easier to do that. There's some people even where voting by mail isn't the easiest thing in the world. You can look at the voting rates. It's minorities vote by mail at a lesser rate than others, and so, or a lower rate than others. And so I think that's a big piece to it. But I think there's a whole wide variety of additional reforms that need to be put in place to make sure that in the midst of a pandemic, you're not sacrificing a democracy.
Let's take a look at a couple of questions. Is there a discussion to help small business owners that didn't pay themselves a weekly paycheck? Would they qualify for unemployment or help that relied on revenue for cash flow?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, sole proprietors are covered under the Paycheck Protection Program. So I believe they should be. And Kevin, I don't know if you're on, but if you have a question, if you have an insight to that, you can let me know too.
Yeah. So sole proprietors who make under $100,000 are eligible for the PPP program. So they're eligible to be able to cover payroll costs as well as some rent, mortgage obligations, or utility costs, depending on what type of business they have. Anybody who's making over $100,000, I will be getting back to, because I don't have a straight answer from the Small Business Administration on if they will be paying a portion of their money or if they're just not eligible under that program.
Okay, thank you. And Kevin, while you're there, it's two related comments really. We applied for an SBA emergency loan and then the website crashed, was told to mail it to Fort Worth. Haven't heard anything, not even if it's been received. And someone else says, is there any way to find out if the paperwork was received, or do we literally just have to wait? Our landlord is not budging on our obligation to them.
Yes. Unfortunately, there is, as everybody knows, a massive backlog in the Small Business Administration right now because they are rolling out a lot of these new programs. My best suggestion would be to contact the regional office in New England, which is located in Boston. I can put their phone number and contact information in the chat box on the side in a minute, just so you can reach out to see if they can track if they've at least had receipt of that. That would probably be the best way to do it than waiting for individuals to get back to you. Obviously, it's a slow process, but I know the congressman can speak a little bit more on the process in Massachusetts where they are. There is a moratorium on rental obligation, and you cannot get evicted or kicked out of your space for a certain period of time. But he could speak a little bit more on that.
Great, thank you.
So, Kevin, thanks. And I've already received a number of questions and inquiries of just that. So people that had filed for assistance in the days beforehand, and the system went down, and SBA says that they've lost that information. So we're also following up on a number of inquiries. Kevin, I think if you can provide that information in the chat, that would be helpful. If for your specific, in your specific case, whoever it is that wrote that question, if you do have a question about additional protections for landlords and tenants, so if you're paying rent or if you are a landlord, and what you can expect or what your rights are given the circumstances, you can certainly reach out to. We're happy to follow up with details, but there have been additional protections put in place. The other thing that I'd say is, I think one of the potential things that we are, I know that a number of colleagues are looking at here, and I'm looking at in detail as well, is some aspect of kind of essentially a forbearance across the board. So freezing the system to basically say, if you're going to look at saying, hey, you got to stop rent checks, that's a huge benefit and alleviation of anxiety for renters. That doesn't help the landlord then pay the mortgage. And if you freeze the mortgage, that doesn't help the bank that actually financed that mortgage that is expecting that revenue to come in to pay off other obligations. One thing that you can do is essentially freeze it across the board and roll it down, so you're not saying it's not a forgiveness across the board of all debt for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, however long it needs to be. But it does say you'll pay it after a certain period of time with some assurance from the government at some sort of interest rate. But it just means that you actually freeze this throughout the entire chain so that you don't have a string of defaults. And I know that there's a number of us that are looking at what that plan could look like and exactly how you could make something like that work. Because if this does keep going, people are going to need some level of assistance and assurance there, but you got to get that entire chain right, because if you miss one piece of it, the consequences are going to snowball.
Right, and we have the concern also, obviously, for our business owners who are also struggling to pay rent, and the landlords. Someone wrote in and asked, "Is there relief for landlords of the restaurants that can't pay rent? We have bills too."
Of course, and so that's So that's part of it. And again, depending on how your real estate company is going to be structured, you could qualify for some of the business protections we put here as well. One, two, that's part of the forbearance package that I'm talking about, is that recognizing that as much focus, and again, rightfully so, on those shop owners to make sure that those restaurants and small businesses don't crater. The person who owns that building also has obligations they need to make. And that bank is expecting revenue coming in to be able to make their obligations. And so you need to keep this entire system functioning. And if you're only focused on one part of it, but not how that cascades down the chain, you're going to see the system, break. So 100%.
Right. So just a reminder for those of you who are participating on Zoom, at the very bottom of your screen, you see a Q&A box, and you can type your questions in there. Let me ask you to help me understand. We know how dysfunctional Congress has been for so long, and I'm trying to get a sense of how it maybe is. Does it feel different now? And I asked that knowing that the other day you had to drive 8 hours back and forth to Washington just because of one obstructionist who forced you to pass this bill. So is it changing? Is there a sense that we're in this together? Is there still a lot of partisan bickering?
He got kicked off a bunch of Christmas card lists after that's done.
Yeah.
The good news is, Greg, there was no traffic on the road. So I guess that's one silver lining of the drive down to DC and back. So the way I think about this is Congress is a reflection of a country, and the country is divided and polarized. And so Congress is going to be divided and polarized. And I think a bit more so given the structures here. We've talked about this before: gerrymandered districts, campaign finance reform, some of these other things that make Congress kind of reflective of a more partisan, a more polarized electorate than where the majority of the American public are. That being said, this pandemic that we're in the middle of is affecting everybody, and a widespread acknowledgement that not only is the potential impact here going to be very broad and very deep and very painful for an awful lot of folks, but that those folks obviously are young and old, rich and poor, black and white, north, south, east, west, and everywhere in between. And so you saw, for the first time that I can remember, in a very long time, a bill, the largest economic recovery package in American history, passed out of the Senate unanimously, 96-0, right? That was Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren who signed on to the same bill. There's not a whole lot of things on that, just given the political ideology that separates some of the more conservative Republicans and the more progressive Democrats out there, but in a recognition that this bill is not the way that probably Ted Cruz would have written it, and it's not the way that probably Senator Warren would have liked to have written it, but a recognition that at this point, getting 80% or 70% or 75% of what you wanted is at this point good enough, because the pain here of trying to fight over this for much longer is going to be so acute for so many families that you can't wait. And so I think you have actually seen over the course of the past couple of weeks, Congress come together and act on some pretty extraordinary measures in fairly rapid time. Now, does that mean we've gotten everything right? No. Is it everything the way I would have done it? No. Welcome to representative democracy in a time of urgency.
Right. And meanwhile, we have the president who doesn't want to reopen the Obamacare marketplaces for insurance. And
look, I think a couple of things on that, and I want to be respectful of the forum in here and such. I think the fact is, under any circumstances, this crisis would stress our system, and you've got a healthcare sector at 100,000 feet is based off of a doctor-patient relationship, right? If up until now, if I had a sore throat, or if you broke your leg, or whatever else, you call your doctor, you come in, you get examined for something, X-ray, strip test, whatever else. You get told whether something was broken or needs to get fixed, and you get some medicine, and you go home and you get better. That system works really well if that's the nature of healthcare delivery. That does not work well if you have thousands, if not millions of people that need healthcare and need access to testing all at the same time and all for the same thing. And so our healthcare system would be stressed no matter who was in charge at the moment. However, that weakness in our system was not unknown, and what does not come as a surprise. If you talk to anybody that actually had a knowledge of the strengths and weaknesses of our system, people would have said a pandemic is going to be a big risk. If you talk to anybody that was looking at international foreign affairs or international commerce, they would say that the risk of a pandemic was real. We saw Ebola, we saw MERS, we saw SARS, we saw H1N1. We've had a number of these pandemics take place over the course of recent history. And that's why we had responses to it. You had people in the National Security Council dedicated to responding to a pandemic. You had people within HHS, the National Level of Health and Human Services, dedicated to looking at a pandemic and coordinating international response. Those folks were fired by this administration. Those positions were not filled. HHS actually did a simulation about a year ago where they looked at the spread of a novel virus that started at an animal market in China and was spread by air travel around the world, and ended up in having hundreds of thousands, if not a couple million people here in the United States die. HHS ran that simulation and they buried the report. So, well, I think it is fair to say this is a crisis that the world has not confronted in, at the very least, 100 years. Because you go back, well, maybe World War II, or you go back to the Spanish flu in 1918. There are measures that could have been put in place to try to ensure that we were more ready for it. Because you can't say, well, no one could say that we knew that this was going to happen this way and at this time. We did know that something was going to happen at some point because it had happened, and we were just more prepared to respond to those incidents, although those incidents are different than this one. But I think things like not invoking the Defense Production Act until very recently, and in a very, I think, limited way with regards to one company, General Motors, for ventilators. And when you know that this administration has invoked the DPA hundreds of thousands of times, but in its history, and again, it's only 3+ years old, but if you're invoking it hundreds of times a day but won't do it for masks and PPE, why not? If you're now projecting 100 more people to die of this at the low end than Korea and Vietnam combined, why we're not doing this with a sense of urgency? And when you say, hey, Congress has made sure that no one that needs a test has to pay for it, that's great. But you know what? If you get sick, and if you get really sick and you gotta go in the hospital, if you have a short-term duration insurance plan, junk plan, if you don't have insurance, you're no question going to be bankrupt coming out of this. You're going to look at hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. I have a friend's daughter that's been on a ventilator for over 2 weeks, right, in an ICU. 2 weeks, right? That family without insurance would be financially devastated. And that's happening to thousands of families across the country. You had the ability to open that up and make sure that people had access to insurance so that we could pay for it. And decided not to, and I don't have a good explanation for that.
Okay. All right, another submitted question. What kind of help is there, or maybe it should there be, for undocumented immigrants who do so much of the heavy lifting for all of us? Farm workers, likely many delivery drivers, restaurant help, all kinds of people.
Limited, right, is the short answer here. So the good news is that so there are no restrictions in terms of who gets access to a test by the federal government based on immigration status or your ability to pay. So if somebody needs a test and qualifies for a test, however those qualifications are being decided locally, and that depends on the availability of tests in different localities, but no one is testing for immigration papers or a social security card or anything else. If you need one, you can get access to that test, again, assuming you qualify for under the local restrictions, and you don't have to pay for it. The challenge then, as I said, is if you are in a place that if you don't have health insurance, how do you pay for the treatment? And that's going to be still a barrier to care, because if people can't pay for it, they're either going to potentially pass away, or they're not going to get the care that they need and potentially spread this to other people. The additional assistance that we're talking about, those direct payments, the small business assistance, all the rest of it is contingent on the various restrictions that are put in place under the federal government pay guidelines for on immigration. So undocumented workers are not eligible for. So that's where, you know, the additional measures outside of federal government assistance is so important. Those food drives, dependent on local donations and local charity and acts of generosity, is going to be so important and so critical. And whoever asked the question, I'm grateful for it. You know, the nature of the immigration debate in Washington has made it such that I don't foresee that part changing under this administration anytime soon.
A couple of questions here and on Facebook about unemployment benefits for the self-employed business owners. And I think partly this is a state holdup, because I know that some states are allowing it, but I don't know if you have any information about when there might be more clarification on that.
So under the Paycheck Protection Program, the self-employed folks are eligible for it. And I think this is one of those examples that I talked about before in trying to get the federal and state system to line up. I have not spoken to the governor directly about this piece of it, but I have no doubt that they're doing everything they can to move through this as quickly as they can, understanding that not only is the system stressed in the state, but the system nationally, they've got 50 different states that are trying to work part of this out. And I don't say that to minimize the concern or the urgency, but just to say that we are aware of it and we're trying to address it as quickly as we possibly can. I've had a number of small businesses, sole proprietors, and self-employed folks that have come up to me and talked about, interestingly enough, a number of them, several were actually massage therapists, that just said, look, you know, we can't do our business without being in close personal contact. So if this goes on for a while, you know, business is literally over. What are we going to do, right? So understanding that there's a bunch of different businesses that would qualify here, we're trying to do everything we can to get this stood up as quickly as we can.
Right, and part of that is the unemployment platform, even in Massachusetts, isn't accepting it yet. I can tell everyone that we've asked that question of the state as well, and hope to have that answer. And we are doing our kind of daily email updates. So if you're on the Chamber's email list, we'll have an answer for you. And if we get anything from the Congressman's office, we'll have an answer for you on that too. You can sign up for that email list on our website, nnchamber.com. So we do have a couple openings for questions. If anybody has one, you can submit them through the Q&A box. And, you know, Congressman, still just a lot of comments about landlords and getting assistance and tenants not being able to afford their rent. Hard questions I know you've touched on a little bit, but I just wanted to mention they keep coming in here. So
very tough questions, and understandably so, right? Kevin mentioned earlier, again, the moratorium on evictions. And again, that's helpful. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue of, which we are also working on, whether one, paying that rent at some point down the line and the size of that rent payment that's necessary. Two, making sure that your credit rating isn't hit by somebody calling out a creditor, calling into a credit agency or reporting that debt to a credit agency. It's why also, Greg, I mean, I think, as you know, excuse me, I had proposed a far more generous direct payment program. So not $1,200, but $4,000. And that strikes people as a lot of money. And on the one hand, it is a lot of money. My proposal was to break that up, $2,000 now and $2,000 in a month. But to understand that for folks that are, one, making it universal, so everybody gets it. Two, and we broke it down a bit on income. So if you made less than $100,000, you got $4,000 per person. If you made over $100,000, $2,000 per person. But making that essentially universal across the spectrum, because you can deploy this money more rapidly, because IRS has bank account information or address for the vast majority of folks that did file it, for all the folks that filed their taxes, we can get that money back to you much more rapidly. So that if there's some grace period, even if rent was due yesterday, if there's a grace period of 4 or 5 days before people say, hey, you know, we're going to dock you or you're going to enter into some default structure. If we can get it to you by the end of the week or early next week, you can get that money out and pay that obligation. So if you're a family of four that's making less than $100,000 between the two wage earners, right, you're going to get $12,000. That's $6,000 this month, $6,000 next month. That was my proposal. That does provide an awful lot more assistance to try to make sure that the gears here don't grind to a halt and that there is still liquidity through that system. And that was the goal behind it. We pushed hard for it. We got something at $1,200. And again, I think the goal here was the idea from the Senate on, again, that the draft of the bill was between that direct cash payment that would come quickly, the unemployment assistance that is more generous than it had been in the past for folks that are unemployed, and then the small business piece, understanding there's a bit of a lag in the duration there, but getting that out would provide additional layers of assistance. But without question, we need to get that money out. We need to get it out now.
Right. And there are a couple of questions related to that. Is the $1,200 taxable?
The $1,200, that's a great question. Kevin, do you know? I think it is taxable.
I believe that it was not taxable, but let me check on that and get back to you in the next 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Is there discussion about having credit card payments due for business expenses that it's hard to pay now because of lack of revenue? The worry is hurting your credit score in the future. Is there any discussion about how all that works out?
Yeah, so 100%. And we had mentioned, you and I had mentioned a little while ago, the forbearance issue here, and
Yep.
the reason why, the value of that in freezing across the system, but then also instructions to the credit agencies that you can't ding anybody. And there's been pressure on the credit agencies at the moment to, and creditors to say, hey, if somebody's behind, don't report them, don't ding their credit. But that's now at this point largely contingent on the desire of either the agency or the creditor. But there's been without question, and we've advocated for this, I've advocated for this as well, assistance there, that understanding that you're seeing an awful lot of individuals, car companies that I know of. For one, you've seen some of the ads on TV that are providing some additional assistance, saying we're not going to ding your credit, and some banks as well. Well, this doesn't work if credit agencies start dinging people's credit, whether that's individual businesses or, by the way, states, which is a big potential consequence of this too, as we look down the road.
When you discussed this bill, was there a conversation about whether it was inequitable to give the same amount of money everywhere, everybody, given that the cost of living is so different in different places?
Yes, and a big issue that came up. And Greg, the only thing I could say on that is, so one, acutely aware of it. I think when I last checked, the cost of living in, say, Manhattan is about 30 to 40% higher than it is in Oklahoma, right? The other thing I'd say is, for a member of Congress, regardless of where you are, we all still get paid the same, right? And so while it certainly makes some sense and some logic to say, if we want to treat everybody equally, there should be a cost of living adjustment here, that is also was going to be an additional political fight. That was going to take time, resources, energy, that just, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think was worth the fight to then have to justify publicly. It was going to be hard for Republican colleagues to say, hey, why am I as a small business owner, when you're saying I could be eligible for, if somebody in New York is eligible or Boston is eligible for $10 million of forgiveness, why am I only eligible for $6? And to try to go through that argument to say, well, we give based on cost of living, X, Y, and Z, that's a harder pill for them to swallow than just to say, hey, we're treating everybody equally no matter where you are, understanding that states and communities with a higher cost of living are going to be prejudiced by it. But again, it's where the urgency of time, I think, won out over the purity of the policy. But one of the accommodations that was made.
Right. Question about unemployment insurance rates and whether employers will be dinged for that when that happens.
Unemployment insurance rates?
Yeah, so so when the business gets their rates
Yeah.
charged for their, right.
I don't believe so. I hadn't been asked that question though, and Kevin, I don't know if you know, but I have not heard anything about that at all.
My understanding is those aren't set until January, so there's time
Yeah.
to work that particular problem out.
Right.
And there has been a provision placed into the bill that allows the state to work with specifically nonprofits who are mostly impacted by this to give them relief to not have to pay a portion of the unemployment benefits they typically have to pay under this clause. So a lot of the nonprofits only have to pay state unemployment taxes or pay a portion of unemployment when one of their employees becomes unemployed. So they have the two options. So there is a provision that allows states to aid with that. And there's also a federal provision to reimburse nonprofits up to a certain percentage of the unemployment that they do have to pay out during this time.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So a question for you, Congressman, not a bigger scale question. I realize that we're really only in the first act, maybe the end of the first act of this crisis, but it's always good to sort of look down the road at what the end game is. At the end of this, what do you hope that history will say about how we responded to this crisis? And what do you fear that it might say?
So two things first, because I just saw one of the comments come up. Kevin, if you can you put in your correct email address? Because somebody said it was bouncing back. So if you can, just put it in so that people have it. Perhaps far more important immediate response to your question, Greg. So what do I hope comes out of it? Look, I think we're in a very dark time. We're going to be in a dark time for a while, and I think we need to be honest with our government needs to be honest with the American public about what that the nature of the depth of the challenge that we're in. I think you're also seeing this extraordinary resilience of an American public that is in the midst of a time where everybody is challenged, seeing this incredible generosity that is coming forward, which is inspiring. And I think it reassures me that we are going to get through it. I do think that COVID-19 has been a diagnostic die that has shown in Technicolor some of the fractures and fissures in our society, and the way in which our society is based upon, our economy is based upon folks that don't have access to, whether you want to call it the traditional benefits or the social safety net or other structures of our economy. So whether that's one, as we already talked about, access to healthcare, right, and universal insurance, because it does not matter. You're not going to tax cut your way out of this problem to make sure that people are healthy. And if there's a lesson of this, it is that my health is linked to somebody else's. And the fact that this happened now, it's going to happen again, whether it's this fall with, like most coronaviruses, this family of flus that mutate and come back again every year, or whether it's something else that comes because of a more tightly globalized world. We're going to face more of these moments, and we're going to have to respond to them. So one is healthcare access, insurance, and a system that can in fact has sufficient stocks of protective equipment, has sufficient ability to ramp up testing, all of the rest of that. So that's one. Two, things like paid leave and universal paid leave. Why? Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because if somebody is sick, we want you to go home and get well. Don't have to come into work and get the rest of us sick. Go back and take care of yourself, and not have to choose between your financial livelihood and your health and everybody else's health. Three, things like childcare. Right? Greg and I were joking before. Our childcare support system is gone, like it is for many people at the moment. My wife and I are trading off time with our kids so that she runs a nonprofit dedicated for, oddly enough, childcare. And so, we're struggling with those, caring for the kids all day and then getting them to bed, and we'll go back to work till midnight, and you get up very early in the morning before they do so you can get to work before they get up. And the way in which our society relies on childcare in order for everything else to function, yet those folks, there's no safety net for those childcare providers, and there's no safety net. They're way underpaid. The system doesn't work. It's way too expensive. And so the opportunities we have here to actually make this system, our economy, our society, not just more equitable, but a stronger foundation so that everybody can participate and that we're more resilient. So when this happens again, and I say when deliberately because it will, when this happens again, we are far better equipped to attack it aggressively, to minimize it, to mitigate against it, and to make sure that we can get in front of it so you don't have to talk about spending literally trillions of dollars on the back end to make up for this. Because that's what it's going to take, and that's what this one's taken, and we're not done yet.
And you would hope that that would mean also we'd be paying more serious attention to other issues like climate.
100%. Look, I think, so the impact of climate and what I would hope, right? I think there's a better chance, Greg, that given the impact on our health sector, and issues around gig economy workers and independent contractors, because we are all seeing this now, and you see what happens when you don't do this right. I think there's going to be a bit of push to say, hey, this is what happens when you do, this is what has to change, because we've learned the lesson the hard way. I think there's going to be an opportunity to say, hey, let's not learn the next lesson the hard way, and that next lesson is going to be climate, because you're seeing, well, nobody can say at this point that the spread of this disease is related solely to climate, or is because of climate change. The impact of a single event and the drastic consequences it can have across a society or world. This is showing how much one thing can lead to just a global crisis that is extremely dire and extremely expensive. And again, this is before we've seen really the spread of COVID throughout much of the developed world, right? Through parts of rural China or South America or Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Southeast Asia. And when that happens, what that means for those economies, those healthcare systems where I think it was in Liberia, I think it was where they have 3 ventilators total. So we've got, for these high impact, low probability events, look, climate is a high impact, a high probability event. We know the consequence of it. It's just playing out over time. Now we're seeing what happens when we don't actually take that risk into account.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time today, for always being available to the chamber and to our businesses. We're grateful to you for your leadership and appreciate all your work you're doing. Thank you very much.
Greg, really grateful. Stay healthy, stay safe, everybody. Other feedback, suggestions, questions, keep them coming. We want to make sure that we're there for you, doing everything we can through this time, and stay well and look out after each other. Greg, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.